So now we have the integumentary system, and this one, in my opinion, is relatively easy. I will try to do my best to point out the difficult bits. So structure and function of the integument, since we just did tissues, you already have some insight into the structure and function of the integument. You actually already know quite a bit about the epidermis because you know about epithelial tissue. And you already know a little bit about adipose tissue and loose areolar connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. So you already have some insight into some of that structure. We'll differentiate the epidermis from the dermis and from the subcutaneous layers, the layers of the integumentary system. Then we'll talk about some structures derived from the epidermis. So hair, skin, nails are all derived. Your nails are just really, really special skin. Your hair is just really, really special skin when we get down to it. Integument repair and regeneration, aging of the integument and development of the integumentary system. Note that on that last exam, I shouldn't even say anything about the exam. This is going on YouTube. People are going to look ahead. All right. So there's going to be layers of the integumentary system. There is also going to be layers of the epidermis. So that's going to be the number one hitch that you're going to see on a lecture, exam, or lab practical scenario is, which layers am I asking you questions about? Am I asking you questions about the epidermis, or am I asking you questions about the integumentary system? And that'll make more sense in a bit. I'm going to drive that home because the more I stand on that soapbox, the fewer people make that mistake. And I really appreciate it when fewer people make that mistake. This is your integument in total. You have an epidermis, which is just this top layer, so above the basement membrane, superficial to the basement membrane, and it's a wavy basement membrane, just like you know from your tissues lecture. Your epidermis has a basement membrane, many, many layers because it's stratified. And it is keratinized, so you're going to have this multiple layers of dead tissue right along the top there. Then there's your dermis, and your dermis will be vascular, for one thing. You can see all of these red and blue blood vessels in here. It's going to be very highly innervated, multiple types of nerves. We're going to start learning the names of the different nerve endings today. This will be the location for various glands, sweat glands, sebaceous glands. And you're going to have a couple of different types of connective tissue in here. So this is a connective tissue layer. Deep to that, we want to shut that door. As much as I love that cohort, thank you. Okay, subcutaneous tissue is technically not part of the integumentary system. When you separate the integument, you separate it from the subcutaneous layer. But we're still going to address it as part of our integument lecture because it still has a role to play. You can see down here it's rich in adipose tissue. So this layer is highly variable between individuals. So roles of the integument, that one was pretty easy, right? Protection, prevention of water loss may be a little bit surprising. When I bring up evolution, you don't have to personally believe in evolution. You do have to learn it for the sake of understanding sciences. So ever since our evolutionary ancestors emerged from bodies of water, they've had to develop ways of preserving water. So your integumentary system is actually very lipid rich, and that's actually going to create a sort of fat barrier, and including in the epidermis, I'm not just talking about the adipose layer. Part of that oiliness of your skin is to keep water in. In fact, part of the danger of getting a burn and compromising your integumentary system is water loss. That's one of the most dangerous parts of widespread burns over the body, is dehydrating out of that open surface. So it is a water barrier. Temperature regulation, you'll have sensory receptors just for temperature. Metabolic regulation, immune defense, just the fact of those multiple layers, and then a couple of cells that can travel within that dermal layer will help with your immune defense. Sensory reception innervated both in the dermal layer and in the epidermal layer. You do have some nerves of the epidermis as well. And excretion by means of secretion. If anybody has ever gone on a bender, probably not you, a friend of yours, a hypothetical friend, went on a bender and the next day they were working out and they smelled like booze, that's how you can prove to yourself that you secrete some things through your skin. You do secrete some waste products through your skin. Okay, any questions so far? So that epidermis, again, is avascular, and that concept, once again, comes from our general concept of an epithelium. All epithelia are inherently avascular. The epidermis, in particular, is keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium, and there are many layers to the epidermis, and just for the skin, we are going to have very specific names for very specific layers. Does anybody have a geology background and know the word strata? Anybody want to talk about strata? Has anybody heard the word strata before? It's context, just this. Yeah, so layers. So you could look at the side of a cliff and see different colors in that cliff that represent different strata. They represent different time periods in geology. So this is a shared scientific word that just means layers. Within each of these layers we're just in that epidermal layer right now, you have a variety of types of cells. Most of them are going to be keratinocytes. This just means cells that are filled with a protein called keratin. Maybe you have a fancy shampoo that promises to put keratin on your hair. We're going to see why that might not really be that useful today. And these cells, keratinocytes, will be tightly connected by desmosomes. What was a desmosome? What did it do? It's a snap or a rivet, and it's going to help with what aspect of structure? Strength. So it's going to be on those lateral surfaces, and it's going to keep those cells connected to each other laterally, right? It's going to be tough to pull away one cell without pulling away multiple cells, and they're going to have a lot of strength between them. Next, you have a few melanocytes. Our melanocytes we're only going to find on the lowest, deepest layer. We'll define that later. Your melanocytes synthesize the protein pigment melanin. So the genes, the DNA blueprints they use, are going to determine the quantity and shade of the melanin pigment they produce. They're not keeping that melanin for themselves. They are giving that melanin. They have these cool cellular processes that give that melanin to other cells. So these are going to determine skin color and freckles and things like that. So obviously there's a huge genetic determinant between different people's different quantities and qualities of melanocytes. Being mostly Scottish myself, I have very, very few and poor quality melanocytes. It's not working out with the melanocytes over here. The job of that melanin that is produced, it's actually really awesome. It makes a little umbrella, like an actual umbrella for the nucleus. So it's actually going to prevent UV radiation from hitting that nuclear material, that genetic material, and that's actually going to help prevent mutations. So it is protective. Melanin is there to be protective from UV radiation, which prevents mutations, and preventing mutations helps prevent cancer. So being this white in Colorado is not a good idea. I'm wearing an SPF right now. I am indoors. It's okay. I need it. Occasionally you'll have some macrophages. What's the word macro and phage mean? Big eater. So it's a modified white blood cell that's going to live in the epidermis, even though it's avascular. It migrated there. And a couple of sensory receptors known as Merkel cells. Those will be the nerves that make it all the way up into the epidermis, as opposed to all of the other types of sensory nerve cells that you will see in the dermal layer. Okay, are we ready for some layers of epidermis? For lab practical purposes, the image that I would use on the lab practical will be the image that is in your textbook, not this histology image. But this one I do like for you to see a variety of histology images to see how they look in different places. And this is a particularly good one. So it goes from deep to superficial in terms of growth. You always have the option to learn it superficial to deep, that's fine. The deepest layer that's connected to the basement membrane is the stratum basale. It's the basal layer, so it's pretty much in the name that it's going to be at the base. This is going to be where those cells multiply. This is where those keratinocytes, the major cell of the epidermis, are undergoing mitosis and replenishing the many, many layers of this stratified epithelium. And you will have slides that describe these specifically. If you're rushing to write everything down, feel free to write more things down, but it will be caught. You won't be missing anything if I speed ahead. Now again, the epidermis, vascular or avascular? Avascular. So as we get further away from that basement membrane, we get further away from our source of nutrition. And again, remember, source of nutrition, gases, nutrients, etc., wastes. So as we get further away from that oxygen and those proteins, carbs, fats that we need from the cardiovascular system, the cytosol is going to start to dry out a little bit. While it starts to dry out, the cells start to take on a spiny appearance. These names are not accidental, they were very literal. Stratum spinosum, the cells take on a spiny appearance. Then in the next layer, getting even further away from this nutrition source, they become granular, stratum granulosum. They take on a granular appearance as that keratin starts to sort of change form a little bit, kind of solidify. There's actually two types of skin, thick and thin. We're mostly going to show you thick because it's got an extra strata, the stratum lucidum. And in the stratum lucidum, these cells have started to die and lose their nuclei, and they look almost transparent. So lucid, clear. Finally, that keratinized layer we're going to call the stratum corneum. So if you're exfoliating and you're trying to get a bunch of dead skin to slough off, you're sloughing off that stratum corneum. That's what's going to come off. If you've got dry skin, it's going to come off in like flaky bits. Those flakes are all stratum corneum. At least we hope so. If that's not the case, that's a disease. People have come up with mnemonic devices for this before. I can't ever remember them. Something CLGSB. Something about sandy beaches. Sandy beaches. Does anybody remember?
Californians love girls sporting bikinis. Yeah.
I like it. California love girls sporting bikinis. Californians love girls?
Yeah.
Okay. Californians love girls sporting bikinis. I'm for it. I'm okay with that. Whatever it takes. Okay, we've done all of this before, so I'm pretty happy with that. Here's the textbook version of the layers of your epidermis, and here's their histology image. As you can see, you maybe can see why I don't like this histology image as much compared to using that histology image. So that one's got those clear lines of demarcation already labeled for you. So here's the basement membrane. So you can easily identify the stratum basale because it's always going to be adhered to that basement membrane. I think that granular layer is pretty obvious on this one. It's nice and dark, granulated. Lucidum is not as clearly demarcated on this one, as in my opinion. But corneum is, at least up here, fairly obvious. So this is the medical illustration version, the cartoon version, that is really, really nice and clear. And if you even look closely at this image, you can see some sort of dots that they illustrated to kind of demonstrate why these are considered spiny. So it's a pretty good cartoon. I'm okay with it. Any questions about those strata? We do have a slide for each of those strata coming up, but anything so far? Okay. For some reason we're starting at spinosum. Why do I not have basale? That's really weird. Okay, whatever. Stratum spinosum. Once we get away from that first layer, the stratum basale, these cells are no longer dividing. Yes? Oh, there it is. Why didn't I not see that? Okay. Stratum basale. Keratinocytes undergo mitosis here. They are the most abundant throughout the skin. They produce that keratin molecule that's going to stay in it. And that's also about waterproofing. And melanocytes will only be found along the stratum basale. They have cellular extensions that allow them to put melanin into many layers, but they will always be found along the stratum basale. And your tactile cells will be connected to that stratum basale. I think you've got a good illustration of that tactile cell right here. So you can see this sort of yellowish nerve ending right here connected to this blue cell right there with multiple projections. That's going to be their representation, at least, of a tactile cell. I don't think it's going to be very recognizable from a histology image for you guys, so if I was going to ask you anything about that, it would be on this image. There's the melanocyte over on that stratum basale. There's their melanocyte labeled. There we go. Okay. As we get away from the stratum basale, we go into the stratum spinosum, where it starts to take on a spiny appearance. I'm going to draw it up on the board. Sorry, YouTube's not going to get the benefit of this. It's like you had a nice plump cell that produced a bunch of keratin, which is going to be a long, sharp protein like that. And then as you start to dehydrate around that long, sharp protein, it's like you sucked all of the water out of that water balloon, but it's full of sticks. So that's what they mean by spiny. At the microscopic layer, it looks like that. Granular layer, Stratum Granulosum. That keratin filament is filling that cytoplasm. The organelles are beginning to degrade. So some of that granular appearance is going to be the death of organelles. Lots of lipids in this layer forming that water barrier for us. Stratum lucidum only in thick skin. So thick skin is on the palms of your hands and soles of your feet, no matter who you are. This is your location for thick skin. Its job is to be several layers thicker compared to thin skin to be more protective from abrasion. In the stratum lucidum, that keratin is actually going to transform into another protein known as elidin. Really just that vocab word is what I would focus on. Elidin is in the stratum lucidum. It's a modified form of keratin. It's just part of its process of cell death, basically. Stratum corneum varies very much in thickness. In thick skin, it's going to be very, very thick. This would be a representation of thick skin. You can tell because of how many completely dead cells. You completely lack organelles, no nuclei within any of these layers, and can be sloughed off by abrasion via exfoliation, scraping, whichever. So here's thick skin, basement membrane's all the way down here. You can see all of these layers of the stratum corneum, all entirely dead. This is very, very thin skin. I'm not entirely sure where this is. It's not a freckle, or this is a person with a darker skin tone. Histologically, it's impossible to tell the difference, at least as far as I know, between a freckle and a person with darker skin. And you can see just a couple of layers, like 3-5 layers of stratum corneum up here, max. And this is the basement membrane here, below that pigmented layer. Cool, right? Any questions about that? Now again, skin tone is determined by genes. Your melanin pigmentation is determined genetically. Some alterations to pigmentation of skin can include the presence of blood or blood vessels. Hemoglobin can change color to a more reddish hue. Melanin, again, determined genetically and increases after exposure to UV radiation. Go out in the sun, I get a sunburn and turn lobster red and then peel and then I'm white again. But a person with more melanin or moderate amount of melanin may just get darker. And then beta carotene is something that you get nutritionally, especially from things like keratin, or from carrots. And if you eat way, way, way too much beta carotene, you can turn orange. That is a thing. I found this histology picture that really shows this cell like actually wearing a little hat of melanin. So you can see the nucleus right where my laser pointer is right now. Take that away. There's the nucleus, and there's this little hat, this little umbrella of melanin. It's like a cap. Isn't that so cute? Now there's such a thing as sunspots. Sometimes the word sunspot is used colloquially to just mean a sort of, highly pigmented spot or like a liver spot. That's technically incorrect. Technically, sunspots is a fungal infection. Now, even when I looked this up later to confirm that it was a fungal infection, I found a lot of sources of just like estheticians talking about treating sunspots and it not being a fungal infection. So it is very colloquially common for that to be used incorrectly as for a non-disease state. Okay, and we kind of did this. Albinism is going to be a genetic condition in which that DNA, that blueprint for melanin, is completely useless. It's damaged or it's absent. And that person will not be able to produce any melanin despite whatever genetic heritage they have. Their skin will be entirely white. And melanin is also the pigment in irises, so that will change their eye color as well. That condition is only dangerous in as much as that person is going to be very vulnerable to UV radiation, so they'll be very prone to skin cancer. Bronzing, there are some hormonal disorders that can cause bronzing of the skin, such as Addison's disease can cause skin bronzing. Cyanosis is going to be more of an immediate medical situation. That means they are turning blue because they're not getting oxygen. Erythema is going to be flushing of the skin for some reason. It can be as simple as blushing, or it can be an inflammation response. A hematoma, that suffix oma, has anybody done that in medical terminology? What's oma? It's a tumor. If it's just the word oma, usually we're saying benign. And when we use heme, what's that? Blood. So this is going to be a benign tumor of blood vessels. Oh wait, no it's not. I'm sorry, that's a hemangioma. I'm doing that wrong. A hematoma is just a bruise. And that can be a superficial bruise or it can be a deep bruise. Apologies to my listeners. Jaundice is yellowing. That indicates a liver problem or some kind of problem related to bilirubin clearance.
What's the difference between jaundice and
I don't know off the top of my head right now. Yeah. And pallor is going to be somebody's very pale, or the blood has drained out of their face due to some kind of health issue, maybe a blood pressure problem, circulatory shock. Okay, other variations, a nevus is just a fancy name for a mole. If you ever want to freak somebody out, just tell them they've got a nevus and walk away. There's that hemangioma that I was actually thinking about before. That's the benign tumor of blood vessels. And then friction ridges are literally just fingerprints. So we don't really need to read into fingerprints. There's nothing like personality-wise that indicates if something's going to be a whorl or an arch or a loop or a combination. There's nothing special about it. Okay, questions about any of that? Yes?
I have on topic, kind of off topic, as knowing controls like your eye color too.
Yes.
So I know, like, when you age, sometimes that changes.
I've never specifically heard of that changing with age.
Because I've had, like, family relatives that have been super, super light blue eyes, and now their eyes are, like, green. And I don't know if I'm reading into it, but I noticed that mine started doing that too.
Again, I've never specifically heard of eye color changing. It could be response to UV radiation increasing, but I don't know that I can confirm that. Yes?
On kind of the same topic, would a cleanse do that?
No, definitely not. There are a lot of dubious products out there that claim to change your eye color. They are dubious. They are ripoffs. There's actually a Mythbusters about it. It's a good episode. I think she used hypnosis in that one, but that's okay. She's like, I really want purple eyes. So it was great. Okay, dermis actually has two layers itself. So we did layers of the epidermis. Now we're going to do layers of the entire integumentary system. So if you're looking at a lab practical image and I'm asking you for layers, ask yourself first, am I looking at the integumentary system, like on slide 24, or am I looking at layers of the entire, am I looking at layers of the epidermis? So that's what that epidermis picture looks like on slide 10. And that integumentary picture, is on slide 24 there. So again, two layers of just the dermis. We went from superficial to deep. The papillary layer, we're going to see this naming convention of papilla. A papilla is going to be this rounded, sticking up surface. That's going to be a papilla. That's going to be a papillated surface. So this is a picture of the tongue, the surface of the tongue, at a pretty much microscopic level at that point. These are the papillae of the papillary layer of the dermis. So it's papillary because it's foldy folds. That's what makes it papillary. Immediately deep to the papillary layer will be the reticular layer, and that's just the rest of the dermis. It's deeper and it's thicker and it's not the folds, and that's about it. Okay. What's the reason we ever have foldy folds? Increased surface area. So this increases the amount of connection you have between your dermis and epidermis, and that strengthens that. That's another reason why we can't just peel off our skin, is that papillary layer. Meissner's corpuscles are going to also be known as tactile corpuscles, and they're going to be nerve endings found only in the papillary layers, very close to that epidermis. Since we're already starting to talk about our different types of sensory nerve endings, I want you to just think about this qualitatively for a second. If you were going to put a little nerve ending here and a very big nerve ending down here, what type of pressure do you think this would detect, and what type of pressure do you think that would detect? So starting superficial, what do you think? What's that? So you're definitely going to have temperature receptors in here, but if you're going to put something closer to the surface versus deeper down, and that's definitely a valid direction to take that, since I'm being very open-ended and vague right now. Absolutely. Which one's going to detect deep pressure, like a lot of pressure, poking really hard? The superficial one or the deep one? Deep one, yeah. And which one's going to detect really lightweight pressure? The superficial one. So again, some of this we can intuit. That reticular layer is going to be very rich in collagen. What was our main function for collagen again? Strength. Resisting deformation. So dense, irregular connective tissue with lots of collagen, lots of blood. So this is a vascular layer, has blood vessels, lots of glands. Your hair follicles, I'm going to draw your attention to this. Here's the basement membrane in the papillary layer. It actually folds deep down into the reticular layer of the dermis. This is still basement membrane. This is still epidermis. It's just highly, the phrase for this is invaginated. It's highly invaginated into the reticular layer. Okay. So that's pretty much it for layers of the dermis. Again, hypodermis is technically not part of the integumentary system. It is going to be have a variable amount of fat. It is going to help with insulation and temperature regulation. What else do I want to cover there? I think we're pretty good there. Any questions about the dermis? Good. Lines of cleavage is a really cool concept to me. The idea here is if you are, for example, a surgeon and you're doing a kind of surgery on a person and you want them to heal very effectively from this surgery, you're going to want to cut along a line of cleavage and not against a line of cleavage. It also means that if your kid scrapes a knee or their trunk and gets a scratch, you want that scratch to be along the line of cleavage. If it's against the line of cleavage, it's going to be harder for it to heal. So it's just sort of related to the orientation of the collagen fibers. Collagen and elastic fibers are oriented in parallel bundles in specific locations. So if you cut against this lines of cleavage, the stress is going to be pulling it open. Whereas if you cut parallel with the line of cleavage, the stress is going to be pulling it closed. So this is more likely to need stitches, for example, depending on the depth and severity, or butterfly bandage, or immobilization, than something that's this orientation. I don't think I'm going to ask you specifics for any region. Is anybody like looking at the knees and thinking, that can't be right? Yeah, that's my intuition too. I think I wore the wrong pants today because I actually got a cut exactly like this on my knee. Let's see if I can roll it up. There might be too tight. Ugh. It was like 6 months ago I got this cut, and it's still not healed correctly, thereby proving lines of cleavage go in this direction on the knee. It's not going to work though. These pants are too tight. All right, another day. I'll show you next time. It's really exciting though. Like, it's like, wow, there really is the line of cleavage. So yeah, cuts in this direction on the knee really are going to heal very poorly. It's worse off than cuts that I've had for less than a week on different parts of my body. It's great. So again, surgical implications, first aid implications of lines of cleavage. A striae is a stretch mark. It means that collagen fibers have torn. And UV light radiation with age UV radiation is going to prematurely age. And aging itself is going to reduce flexibility and thickness, resulting in wrinkles. Does anybody want a break? It is 11:55. It's time for a break.